good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the session this afternoon. I would like to introduce Miki, or Mirsad Jacevic, and he's the Deputy Director for Training and Consultation at the Inclusive Security. It's one of the wonderful organizations around the DC area. In his current capacity, he oversees Inclusive Security's training program as well as strategic consultations with leaders from conflict areas around the globe. And I must say that I attended these sessions, and Miki does a wonderful job.
Thank you.
To help them remain focused on promoting inclusion of civil society in all stages of peace processes. He was the primary author of Inclusive Security, a curriculum for women waging peace. That's so impressive.
Thank you.
A highly interactive training manual based on over a decade of experience designing and leading workshops around the world. Miki also directs Bosnia program at the Global Youth Connect, an international organization focused on promoting participation of young people in conflict prevention and resolution. Miki teaches at various national and international schools and a university on a range of topics, including negotiations, reconciliation, transitional justice, post-conflict reconstructions, and security sector reform. He's a human rights activist, a peace program specialist from Bosnia. During the war, he was involved in numerous projects to ease the suffering of the youth and the elderly. Prior to joining Inclusive Security, he directed the Emerging Leaders Project at the State of the World Forum. He managed child soldiers reintegration efforts at Search for Common Ground. He is a PhD candidate at the George Mason University Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, where he will receive his master's degrees. He's also married.
That's the most important part.
Yeah.
Get that right.
And I must say she's a very lucky lady. To a human rights activist, Eva, and they live with their 2 children in the DC area. So, Miki, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mirsad, so much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you as one of the great friends and colleagues. And thank you, Imre, and thank you to the Rumi Forum for this wonderful event. And you know, the last part I want to start with is what is dialogue, and I want to focus my talk on dialogue and then save most time for our questions. But my wife is a Mayan from Guatemala. So we are raising the first couple that we know of the Bosnian Guatemalan Americans who are partly Muslim Catholic, partly Mayan traditionalist, but most importantly, we are experimenting with the use of dialogue daily. And so I want to start by saying that part, obviously, the family and friends come in first. So Imre, thank you for putting this together. And before I even say anything about dialogue, I want to say I really compliment you for coming, and I certainly plan on being more involved because as a Muslim living now in America, I'm often challenged how very rarely we hear good news about the great work of many Muslim leaders, not just in America, but around the world, to promote dialogue, to promote tolerance, and build these bridges. And the kind of, even when we start good initiatives like what's unfortunately happening in New York these days with the center that Daisy Khan is trying to put together, the perceptions tend to be negative. And so the kind of these bringing us together like Imre is doing here is really a fantastic thing. So I know we are on Bosnian time. We started a little bit late. So what I want to do is quickly overview what I would set the talk to be and then really have you ask questions. But As a person focused, I'm really a recovering PhD student. I just cannot get enough of this, even though I've been teaching for a decade. It is, for me, what is the current nature of conflict? So I want to speak a little bit about how conflict has changed, and therefore how our responses to that changed nature of conflict also need to change. And then where does dialogue fit into that picture? And then leave you with one or two examples of what I mean by use of the word dialogue. Let me start by that. It's kind of become politically correct to use dialogue a lot, particularly when the sentence includes Muslims. So we want to dialogue with Muslims, or we want to dialogue with, without really explaining what we mean by that. So I'm going to speak to the format that I actually use in practice and what dialogue has meant for me. But very briefly, I sort of posit there are four key elements of the new conflicts. And the first and foremost, and most important, like what I experienced in Bosnia or what Mishkat has seen in Baghdad and throughout Iraq, conflicts are not anymore fought on the battlefield somewhere out there. It's not like Iran-Iraq war where people would be shipped to the front lines and you would just follow the news. They are now in our houses, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. And so there are these four key elements that I feel are critical to the nature of conflict that I'm working on or talking about. The first one is the issue of identity. That at the core of these modern conflicts is some form of an identity group. It's your ethnic group, it's your religious affiliation, it's your clan or your tribe, but nation state is not the primary unit of these discourses anymore. It's really this identity content, identity unit. The second part of this problem is the what I would call the whole theory of basic human needs, which is that there are obviously those basic human needs such as food and shelter that we need to take up, but these other needs, more psychological needs such as identity, security, belonging, recognition, those are actually more, for those needs people are willing to kill or be killed. And it is how do we mobilize those needs around the issues of identity that is at the crux of this problem. To those two complexities, we add two more dynamics. One is the weak governance. That, again, nation state, in most cases, as you know, in particular, I come from the Balkans, and we've experienced, certainly Iraq as well, other countries, firsthand, that these states were created out of the colonial dreams or nightmares, whichever way you want to take it. And in most cases, the states are not positioned to supply for those basic human needs, particularly not for identity. And it's that weak governance in which states become corrupt and states become not the providers but the key frustrators of these basic needs. And this is primarily what we are seeing in Afghanistan, which is the place I work in a lot. And then the fourth is the complicated international linkages, meaning that these borders are very porous. They don't actually frankly mean much. Examples again, Afghanistan and Pakistan. For most people living, I would say, in Waziristan, and then you cross over into Afghanistan, they don't even know the border exists. It's been porous for centuries, and for them to say that this particular border is the key line around which most of the start of the 21st century has been fought, and America has spent billions of dollars on the ground, that does not translate into really socio-political reality. So those are the kind of four key dynamics that cause modern conflicts. And now the key is how do we respond? And I posit that the modern tools of how we being international community or the states or European Union, whichever way of analysis you want to take, how we respond to those is, I believe, not sufficient. And we have to develop new tools and develop new initiatives. First and foremost, I want to touch on the kind of 3D dynamic that's really kind of overtaken Washington over the last 2 years. 3D being development, defense, and diplomacy. I would say that most of international policy, particularly then dealing with these conflict spots in the world, is still viewed through the lens of defense, meaning the military solutions. And obviously you all know all that old saying that if everything looks like a nail, the only tool we have is a hammer. And so we keep hammering these military solutions, and I think obviously Iraq and Afghanistan brought it vividly to the American attention, but this is what's been happening all across Latin America, Africa, and Asia for the last 20, 30 years. So primary response to these deeply identity-based conflicts in which states are not functional, identity groups are frustrated, has been through military means. And while I'm not a pacifist, I lived through the siege of Sarajevo. Believe me, when I heard those planes in '95, I was fine. But the problem is it's not sufficient. It is never sufficient. Even in places like Bosnia, where it brings a halt to violence, I'd say that the military solution is but a first step. And the discourse in Washington these days is, how do we await July 20th, 2011 to withdraw from Afghanistan, meaning that's the end of that. And I actually posit it's only going to be a start. So the defense discourse, while the primary discourse, and obviously I don't need to remind you how much money it takes, is not ever sufficient. The other two are sort of newer kids on the block. Obviously diplomacy has been around for a while, but diplomacy was mostly done through the lens of the nation state. And now more and more diplomacy is being used as a way to address these underlying causes I was mentioning. And while useful and certainly inspiring when done rightly, diplomacy in and itself, again, is not sufficient because it does not trickle down. It does not translate that the deals made, for example, in Bosnia, the Dayton Peace Accord, become a reality for most ordinary people on the ground 15 years later. Similarly, in Iraq, where you have diplomatically reached solution within the country, so the parliament still maybe had not agreed on the government, but what has not happened is there's still no water. There's still no electricity. There are no solutions for ordinary Iraqis, even though diplomacy helped us reach them non-violently. Again, all great important pieces. Development is the third, and development has arrived. We've always sort of given humanitarian aid, but development as a tool of intervention and conflict resolution is a fairly new initiative. USAID, for example, has just only recently started an Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, trying to link diplomacy and development and conflict resolution. And I posit here the problem with development is we rush to do these development projects without the long-term thinking. Example is Afghanistan. Over the last 8 years, there were about 5,000 schools that had been rebuilt in Afghanistan. And that was a great attempt and a great success. The problem right now is that less than about 1,000 of these schools is in actual use. So we have built these buildings, we have those roads, but the security situation has deteriorated so much that those development successes cannot be used. So I posit that we need to add a fourth D, a D of dialogue. So I would suggest to the Obama administration and other practitioners to do what the Gulen movement has tried to do, which is turn the three-legged stool of this stool of diplomacy, defense, and development into a fourth-legged table that adds that D of a dialogue so that we can all come to that table and engage more meaningfully. Now, what do I mean by dialogue? I really mean a specific form. It's a form of intervention. It is not this metaphor of, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful that people get along together? I learned a very hard way living in the multicultural city of Sarajevo that when these kind of new wars erupt, wishing it be different is not sufficient. I, more than anybody, would have wished that the war didn't happen, that my parents were still okay, that, you know, my hometown, that is, I hope you will all come and visit, one of the most glorious places in Europe, is still what it used to be, but that doesn't make it so. So we need to realize dialogue is a form of intervention that means working very hard through a concentrated effort to really change the conditions on the ground. And so we could do this dialogue top-down, but obviously the approach I take is bottom-up, and which essentially means it's a form of intervention where people, either third parties or leaders from within the communities, organize a format in which people are brought together in a very structured form, where you have a facilitator, where you have representative of the groups, where you have ground rules, so it doesn't happen organically, naturally. It's a lot of hard and orchestrated work. But it is this format of an intervention where people are allowed and actually encouraged to address those four pieces that I was talking about. So the problem in Bosnia was we were never really engaged in dialogue with our brother Orthodox or neighbor Catholics or fellow Jews, to understand what those differences imply and what they mean. And then the only form of engagement became the war, unfortunately. But now that that's done, how do we really learn honestly about each other and look into those four key issues? And so again, dialogue is very hard. And let me say, I often, as a practitioner, really have challenges where people sort of describe it as a form of kind of, to use American jargon, of kumbaya, where people sit around the table and sing songs. That's not what honest dialogue is about. Honest dialogue is very challenging. It means that it challenges you on a personal level to look at your own actions and your own behavior, but more importantly, it links you within community of people, either your own identity group or the people that you live with, or even broader nations and states. And as such, obviously, dialogue is a difficult process with fits and starts. It literally has 5 steps forward and 17 steps backwards, and you have to keep doing it, you have to keep coming back to it. But I perceive it as the only genuine form of transformation that needs to happen, because only once we change how people on the ground in these new conflicts perceive each other and their own behavior will the change be able to occur. It will not come by the signing of a peace accord somewhere else. And let me give you very briefly 2 examples of what I mean by when I say dialogue. The first one is in my native Bosnia, and it involves a group of educators from the region in northeastern Bosnia where most of the original genocide happened and concentration camps were located. And from 95 to 2000, we worked with a group of educators, and we engaged the Bosniak, the Serb Orthodox, and the Catholic Croat teachers. And it was a series of very frustrating conversations because, for example, for the Serbs, their interpretation of what happened during the Bosnian War is that simply Muslims decided to leave. And so they used words of ethnic cleansing to imply immigration or migration, actually. For the Bosniaks, their narrative was of the primary victim, and they were kind of very stuck with the desire to be recognized as victims. And so it was important for each group, again, to address those dynamics, to recognize not only each other's hurts and victimhoods, but also the narratives. Because a lot of these conflicts, again, are placed in the social realm of narrative creation. And in Colombia, for example, I now work with the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what we've tried to do there is, through the work that we do with these women leaders that are amazing, many times the dialogue efforts on the ground are led by the women because they lack entry into that formal space, but they do know how to organize at the local level. And in Colombia, it was the women leaders who were the mothers of the disappeared, of the people who were essentially lost to the civil war, who reach out to the former female combatants of the paramilitary forces and started engaging in the dialogue groups. And again, over the course of about 3 years, with many fits and starts, what has happened is that these women identified the common identity of really both groups being victims. That most of the time, while on paper these women combatants could have been seen as perpetrators, their personal story and their narrative was, again, very much that of the victimhood. So they found something common in the shared identity. And so, again, these processes and examples, essentially very similar to what Rumi Forum does in a different kind of format. I focus on it in a conflict setting, but at the same time, I posit that only those are essentially the genuine way of a difficult path to transformation. So I'll stop there. And
thank you, Miki. It's wonderful for the overview. And I wonder if the crowds would like to ask some questions. Yes, please. Can you, sir, introduce yourself?
I think you started out with a very important point, talking about self-identity. And one of the problems that this country has, and I think a number of European countries and a number of others around the world have, is what I'd call a high degree of ethnocentricity. In this country, we generally see nationality as defined by citizenship of a particular nation state. As you pointed out, that doesn't always apply. In addition to that,
absolutely,
I think to some degree we're caught in a bit of a time warp. You've heard, when you mentioned development, we've heard over and over again in various contexts, people say, what's needed is a Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
Well, the Marshall Plan worked for post-war Europe for a number of reasons, and that simply don't obtain elsewhere. Afghanistan, for example.
Absolutely.
In addition to which, our concept of development isn't necessarily the same as those of a particular country. In addition to that, the whole idea of, you mentioned using military. Actually, I wouldn't use the D, defense, because we're not necessarily defending. But the use of military is also something that we see through an optic of past wars.
Absolutely.
Because you hear phrases like victory.
Yeah.
Or win, lose, and so on and so forth,
Absolutely.
as if we were back in the days of the Second World War. In many situations, it's not. It might be perhaps analogous to a colloid. I mean, where you've got things in suspension, and that's the best you can hope for, until, at some later stage, things change significantly. But I think one of the big problems to get back to is the need to rethink a number of these things.
All of them. I mean, you just said it in native English just more brilliantly than what I had wanted to. And that the key underlying point you're making that I want to highlight is inability to think through and change these things. And in particular, I would say, I'm going to flat out say it as somebody who supported President Obama and certainly had worked on the foreign policy teams of many people in that party. The challenge is, how do you force the discourse to change here in Washington? Because what happens when we intervene in Iraq or Afghanistan right now, we come with these presupposed solutions that even though the problems were not there, very quickly Iraqis adopted as if they were there.
Yeah, that's
very
true.
quickly we broke Iraq along the ethnic lines, where at that particular moment that was not the underlying issue. It was much more about the resources and other pieces.
That's true.
Similarly, I want to highlight what you're talking about, development in Afghanistan. I work a lot, I'm inshallah going to get tomorrow on the plane, and it is the PRT model, in which that is provincial reconstruction teams. We tested that in Iraq, and it's now been the panacea of that kind of what you're saying. We think we have a new solution. And the provincial reconstruction teams are the first attempt to bring these 3 Ds together. And I agree with you, that's just the D covers up for the military. It just sounds nice. It's a sound bite. And so it means that in a particular community, what you have is you have a military arm that includes several civilian officers that are supposed to deal with development and diplomacy. What they don't understand is, obviously, when you come and when you have, and I'm just thinking, it doesn't have to be an ordinary Afghan, people who are particularly unfortunate to have lived the last 40 years in war, but are primarily illiterate and don't have access to international news. But even when you think about Bosnia or Colombia or Iraq, they're much more advanced. If you arrive and convene a shura, but you are there in the full military gear, and you have 30 tanks behind you, the nature of that dialogue will completely change. You come well-meaning. You really do want to have community tell you what you want. But you're there with a gun. That power dynamic in and itself will determine that they will tell you whatever you want to hear. And that is kind of the problem of when we think we are finding this new solution, and you're saying rethinking, absolutely. What's challenging right now in practice, particularly Afghanistan, is pushing this to the test. When you hear reports and when you hear these kind of outcomes, and I think the recent books are pointing to this, for many people this is happening. We are rethinking it. Look at these PRTs, look at all these other models of interventions. And actually we are not. We are just putting the different spin on what the failed attempts on these kind of interventions had been in the past. And where's the solution? I start by saying the primary solution is in the local civil society. Whatever you want to define civil society as, but the first attempt in our thinking is, listen, they don't have an exit strategies. The Afghan people will not have a luxury of departing in July 2011. They will have to stay, just as the Iraqis had to stay, just as the Bosnians, Colombians, people in Sudan. So we have to look from the moment we arrive, who are our allies? Not just looking at the list of warlords and thinking, how do we as quickly sign a bad deal with bad people? Because I will tell you, in Bosnia, essentially, we signed a deal at the Dayton with warlords. We just had election 2 weeks ago. That was a disaster. And so the best we can hope is the lack of violence in these cases, but we do not transform these countries because, again, our premises remain the same as you outlined.
I will take a moment just to follow up with what you have said. The lack of dialogue, which I experienced in Iraq, the example you gave correctly, when all these military people come geared up with their guns, at first Iraqi people talk to them in hope of achieving a quick change. Afterwards, the insurgencies start targeting those who talked to the American troops or the American commanders. As such, people stop talking to them. The result was, well, we don't know what to do. So we start, you know, doing this and doing that, building a school here, building a hospital there. And there are no physicians or doctors who can provide the service. There are no teachers who can offer classes. And in my opinion, a lot of money, you know, were a little bit wasted, if you would like to say. Some investment were not in the right place. Some things, you know, were built halfway and then stopped. All this is a lack of dialogue.
Yeah.
If there was, you know, a continuous dialogue, continuous intervention, as you said, the result would have been much better. We would have provided maybe schools for those who need them, hospitals and places where people can, you know, access help.
Yeah. And I would say in Iraq, if I may, is that I would think it was a lot more than a little bit of misspent money. And in addition to that, what we helped is see the very bad problem of corruption. By almost buying those with whom we wanted to do business because at that moment it seemed convenient, rather than really engaging the local civil society in an honest dialogue.
And then you,
absolutely.
Yes, sir. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Michael Lame, Rethink the Middle East. Comments and questions about three things. One is about identity. It seemed to me that you were saying that the nationhood or national identity is diminishing in importance, and I don't see that. I see the others as coming up, but whether it's American or Turkish or Dutch or Israeli, I think those are not only strong, but will get stronger. On development, on that leg of the stool, I predict a reaction against that, at least in the United States, given our own financial difficulties and the questions that are already there about development equated with nation building. It's one thing to reconstruct or help a Germany or a Japan after World War II reconstruct what was already there, but in Afghanistan you're talking about, perhaps, I haven't been there, leaping several centuries and building thousands of schools where there weren't any. It's not a reconstruction, it is a nation building or development, and with an American sense of we can move people light years, you know, if we put the money in and we put these teams on the ground of, what was it, government in a box or something, that was, those kinds of things. And so I think there's a reaction against that and to using a lot of money for that. And what was the third thing? It just disappeared. Maybe it'll come back.
Perfect. That was typically happening.
Dialogue. I think I understand the point of diplomacy, the point of defense, the point of development. I wasn't clear from what you said what the point is that in that element that you're calling dialogue as a fourth leg of the stool.
So let me answer that one. The point is that the only sustainable change will happen in the local communities. And let me clarify, the thing I'm talking about is not any nation state, any country, any kind of development. I really am talking about conflict zones, where the violent tore a social fabric together. Wherever that social fabric was stated, in Afghanistan, it was in 1970s, that frankly they were a fairly developed nation, that they had, by the Middle Eastern standards, actually had probably by far the most progressive politics, a fairly benevolent king that invested in a lot of development and stuff like that. Or in Bosnia, where you had a perfectly fit European country, or Iraq. So when I talk about my take on these issues, I'm talking about these circumstances where you had a social fabric that somehow functioned, and then the violence erupted around those issues, and it was torn apart. In those cases, I posit you need this fourth D to rebuild that social fabric, to allow for the form that these three will not enable, where local people try to, through mutual dialogue, find local solutions. that will create transformation. So the point and the goal of those kind of dialogues is a long-term transformation. I hope that answers the last one. On the nation state, tied to this, again, I'm not talking about the Netherlands. I'm really talking about places like Bosnia or Iraq or Afghanistan. Ordinary Afghans right now are torn between where is their primary identity. Is it at their clan level and their warlord? Is it to be a Pashtun or a Hazara? Does it mean that if you're a Pashtun, you're automatically anti-Hazara? And all those contexts. In these circumstances, nation state as a unit of solution, which the 3D framework implies, you do development through the government. You do diplomacy through the government. That does not work, because for the vast majority of Afghans, doing the deals with the Karzai government is the cause of the problem. It's not just the Taliban. For many, frankly, and I'm speaking slightly, maybe exaggerating, but for many Tajiks or Uzbeks or Hazara right now, they are thinking about which of the two is the worst evil. Because under the Taliban, and again, don't misinterpret this, there is nothing that this Muslim will defend that these guys are doing. Bad, bad, bad. In the context of Afghanistan, however, the level of insecurity, corruption, maltreatment, and challenges that these groups are facing, for some of them was not as hard, let's just say. The American government doesn't deal through these lenses. We have the government to do the development through. And for these people, then the nation state is a part of the problem. So I'm just further clarifying and agreeing. And then finally, everything you said, development, Dito. I completely agree that there's no question that it is nation building covered up, and that for most Americans, they don't understand, they don't want to be a part of it. And again, it is because we are saying, oh, we are paying these people so much money, and oh, by the way, look how ungrateful they are. Instead of saying, let's partner with these local people in Baghdad, whom, by the way, we don't have to bribe, we don't have to send $6 billion in bags, but rather work over the course of how many, 8 years or more,
exactly.
to identify where's the hospital needed. And then that's a different framework, which, by the way, also works for the efficiency argument. It just works better. It just works more sustainably. But we are not there. So kind of yours is a correct point, unfortunately, with two bad news, which is development is seen as bad, and it unfortunately works badly.
I will give an example to support your opinion. So with Women and the Environment Organization, we work with tribal communities and local leaders. And basically, we educated more than 1,624 women and enabled them to participate in the decision-making locally.
Great.
We covered 43 villages, and we trained 2,557 children. We created dialogue, as you said. The cost of all this was $15,000.
Yeah.
$15,000. And it resulted in really bringing the community together.
Yeah.
So rather than having this approach where women are oppressed and not allowed to participate, they come and attend meeting and say what they really want to say. And one of the wonderful experiences that I myself was part of, during the training, the trainer asked a very difficult question, and a girl, her name was Zainab, she answered correctly. She's 9 years old. And the audience gave her a round of applause, and immediately Ali, her brother, he turned to her and he said, I did not know you are that clever. Next time when I have a question, I'll ask you. So, now generations are talking rather than, avoiding each other. When I asked Zainab if her brother would talk to her or seek her opinion, she said no, not at all. Usually what he does is, give me orders of, cleaning and preparing his meal and all of it. He never said, I'll ask for your opinion. So, the dialogue that you mentioned bridge the gap within the society and brings them together after these difficulties and wars and all of it. And it costs much less, much less.
Absolutely.
I'll take the lady in the back. Can you please introduce yourself?
Rebecca Cataldi. I work for the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy in Washington, and also a former ICAR student.
Oh, great.
As someone who's also a dialogue and conflict resolution practitioner, I have observed something that you mentioned that I thought was very important about the different narratives that you encounter in the dialogue process, and particularly the narrative of victimization. And I think sometimes that when people have been hurt very deeply and very traumatized, they need that sense of victimhood to be acknowledged in some way. And you see that narrative come out. But at the same time, I think we often see the challenge of that the other is sometimes resistant to acknowledging that victimhood, because to do so would to be seen as to identify oneself as an aggressor or an oppressor, or accepting some of the blame for why that person has become a victim. And so sometimes they can withhold that acknowledgement, which I think is so critical often to the healing process. So I wondered if you could maybe speak a bit about how you've dealt with that challenge as it's arisen in your work.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're speaking to is the critical dynamic of, particularly where you have these groups that self-identify as such, but really they're competing narratives as much. For example, in Bosnia, the Serbs' narrative would say that we started this war because we felt threatened because of previous victimhood. And so there is a genuine point to that. And at the same time, the Bosniak narrative is we were the victim. And similar spinning goes as we speak in the Middle East, particularly between Israelis and Palestinians, but other Arab nations as well. And it's part of any identity-based conflict. And I try to speak to that, and behind the scenes I called it almost victimhood Olympics. People really almost competing who is the worst. And I first really debunked through my own personal story the nature of resilience and what it actually means to defeat that framework of victimhood. That actually, settling that victimhood story ain't that great. You won.
That's
okay,
true.
Bosniaks, first victims of the world. Now it sucks. What are you left? You're left with trauma, with difficulty, you are paralyzed, you don't know where to go. And again, I am a psychologist, so I don't necessarily use these terms rightly, probably, and probably many a psychologist would cringe of what I'm doing with it. But the point being, I debunk what it means, number one, even if you were to win the victimhood, what it says. The second part is I really do this through the individual narratives. And it's amazing to me, and this is even still the case in many a dialogue I've done in the Middle East, that the stories of rescuers, the stories of people who risk sometimes their lives to help the other. And almost every dialogue circles, and I attempt to do them small, with about 20 people, they often try to include balance of generations, of genders, so it kind of is a microcosm of that community. Almost unavoidably, you will find a Kurd who was helped by a Shia.
That's true.
You will find a Serb that was saved by a Bosniak. You will find, even again, in Palestine, those people who were helped in 1948, transforming, and so there, in individual narrative, there are these kind of examples that again attack that victimhood narrative directly. And then the third tool I do, I have this thing that was created by some wonderful people who intervene in the Balkans. We use it and we literally have people walk on the steps of the repeated cycle of violence, which we then recycle this victimhood, which ultimate step is, because I felt this way, I can justify my act of aggression.
Right.
Because you hurt me 30 years ago, I recycled the story. It's clear to me that even if I were to start killing you now, I'm justified by it. Or how do you break that cycle? And I have several of these activities where you start really breaking it out by trying to find what is a joint narrative. When did people in Sarajevo feel common fear? And that fear was the same. Every mother in that town felt very afraid for their child, regardless of the political narrative they were given. And again, but this is what I'm saying about this work. Yes, it doesn't cost much, but it requires a lot of attention, a hard work. This is literally rebuilding countries almost one by one. Yeah. And at the same time, why do I feel it's worth it? Because I've seen it work. I've seen the ultimate results in many of these places that got nothing to do with the buildings we rebuilt or the political solutions we found. These communities feel better about themselves once the third party's gone?
I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a diplomat. A plain old engineer. Although I just came back from Warsaw, where I was asked to go and make a presentation on religious freedom of religion, conscience, and so on at the OAC conference a couple of weeks ago. I have the tendency to look at things in a scientific, because that's my formation, scientific, technical, if you wish, manner. And so that, looking at this issue of conflict in that manner, you see that there's a proliferation of conflicts around the world.
That's true.
There's a spreading rather than a diminution.
Correct.
Not only, you see in Africa, every single country has its conflicts, tribal, ethnic, regional. Russia, huge conflicts, Ossetia, Abkhazia, Dagestan, everywhere. China, huge country, Tibet, the Muslims, Falun Gong, whatever. Even in Europe, the most advanced, let's say, aggregation of countries, Belgium is falling apart.
Absolutely.
Belgium
has been for a while.
The capital of the European Union, the seat of NATO, is falling apart because the Flemish and the French cannot get together. They don't want to talk to each other, etc., etc. Cyprus, Turkey, Iraq, and so on. So the question arises, in my mind, and for you, do we really see any progress? Do we really see any signs that because of our increased dialogue, because we have means of communication, we can communicate with anybody we want in the world today. We can have a teleconference with 5, 10, 20, 100 people and discuss our issues instantaneous, in a fraction of a second. We travel easily so that we can see who the other side is. Have we made any progress? Is there any sign, any basis for hope in this issue, in this horrible picture of conflict everywhere? And the second point I want to make is that we in the so-called West, quote unquote, I don't know if I live in the West, but I'm not sure that I'm a Westerner, okay, have a bunch of ideas, of naive ideas, that sort of give us a perhaps not expressed feeling of superiority, that we're the ones who are going to go to Iraq in order to bring them democracy. We're going to go to Darfur to prevent this. We're going to go to Bosnia and impose a solution, quote unquote, if that can be called a solution. We are going to do development, building, and so as I do power plants and solar and wind. That's my job, and that will bring a solution. We have a naive view of this issue, so we haven't really understood the root causes.
Correct.
We haven't understood who we are versus who they are, and therefore we are at an impasse of really bringing some improvement. That's my view.
Beautiful. Agree. On the second part, I think you're absolutely right. And the framework needs to change into that of genuine partnership. And really trying to, because let me just say something, as somebody who was really a beneficiary in Bosnia of the third party intervention, and that third party in that case was primarily the Western states, the United States and Europe. I welcomed every minute of it. It taught this 18-year-old English and German intervention. It improved my ability to communicate with people. It brought so many benefits to so many people. The challenge is I was not asked to deliberate about that. The best of my ability, and I still not a doctor, but I sort of consider myself, if I may say so, a smart person. Nobody asked me at any point as a Bosnian, what would you like to see your country look like? Where do you want to build your schools? What we can come with these, did you mention sort of government in a box, solutions in a box? Because primarily it's a political narrative. We are driven, you have 1 year maximum to be there. You have this much money, spend the money quickly. And really, and this is almost like this pathological sense, we view locals as the problem. And I cannot tell you how it pains my heart when I go to Afghanistan and see all of my particularly mostly American, but as some other Western friends who are now forced to live in the security bubble of the US compound because they cannot leave, they're not allowed to leave. Obviously, you are in a prison of a kind. You cannot appreciate the Afghan culture or the Afghan nature because you don't see it. And it sucks because you're bombed every 3 hours. And you, at some point, do really start saying these local people are just, you know, bad guys. And there is almost, again, pathologization of they are the problem and we are the solution. And so you're absolutely right. But I would say so I don't want to discredit, which is sometimes kind of the liberal left says, well, it's not our business, we shouldn't go there. It is our business. We actually, particularly Iraq and Afghanistan, is America's business. It was caused by, it had become because we chose to make it so. Let's just say, for whatever reason. Iraq is very different than Afghanistan in terms of reasoning. But I think it's really now unfair to have this debate of, well, we can just leave. And that is unfair to the local population on all levels. And so what I'm saying is I hear you and I agree with you, but I don't want to have the narrative of what a lot of on the left are urging, which we should just leave. It's not our business. It is our business. We should just do it in a partnership form because you know what? In every of these places, I mean, Baghdad was so advanced, but even in Kabul, you have a lot of well-educated, smart people who know their local context. They might not be the best engineers by the Western standards, but you know what? They know how to put a bridge somewhere in the Khyber Pass together. And we need to seek and ask them, not just treat them as chai makers who can, you know, translate for us, which is the primary form. Yeah. The second piece is what you talk about, the conflict and is there hope. And let me say, you know, when we lived through the Bosnian War, the Balkans War, we formed a movement of young people around the region, and we called ourselves post-pessimists. Because we could not claim any optimism because we just lived through a genocide. So there was nothing hopeful about that. But we could not allow ourselves to be total pessimists either. Because there are so many wonderful, smart, young, generous, engaged people, men and women in these countries who want to see the better future. And we need to make sure that that narrative of post-pessimism, if not great hope, not the rosy future. But what I want to see is how do we engage with these issues constructively and non-violently. And so the big difference between Belgium and Bosnia is that it didn't take 2 million people to die to resolve the question. You know, I don't care if my cab driver in Brussels would not utter a word of Dutch, because I sort of dribble in it because he only wants to speak French. Well, that's his identity and his issue, and there's a narrative behind there. But he's not going to drive that truck in a NATO headquarters to explode it. And that is a huge difference. And in that regard, actually, because of that, paradoxically, while the issues of identity cause more nonviolent problems, when you look at the reports of the violent indexes of war, it's actually declining. There is literally right now, if you count Afghanistan or Pakistan as an international, there's only 2 or 3 international wars. And even within the last decade, compared to Rwandans and Bosnians of the 90s, the number of internal conflict has also significantly declined. And that means that while conflict persists and continues, its violent expression actually is on the decline, which is good news.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, how do you see dialogue connecting with the other 3 Ds, and if it will have an effect on, like, changing how diplomacy works and development and all of that, because it seems like it's happening separate from it and it needs to be connected. So I was just wondering, how do you see that connecting?
So, specific answer, in Afghanistan, there is now something called National Development Policy, which is Afghan-owned and Afghan-run, and it's being executed through the form of a local shura, which is essentially a village council. And that is the form that, I mean, Americans are still catching up on it, but many Europeans have used so you look what is already existing, because in each of these areas, for generations, you've had some traditional form of dispute resolution. They were primarily family-oriented, you know, somebody stole a cow or but they had existed. And so the first step of connecting particularly development and dialogue is what form of dialogue already exists in the local community, and how do we enter it with the full respect and acknowledgement, but we also have to update it for the current needs. And the best example of that is, you can look it up, is what happened in Rwanda with the form of gacaca, which literally translate on the grass. Communities less than 200 people across the countries have met on the grass over the last 15 years to deal with the most difficult of issues of what happened at the genocide. Point being, in all the countries and communities, some form of these dialogue interactions have been taking place. How do we enter it and pose these questions, or simply like, where do you want your hospital built? And so that is the clearer link that already is taking place between dialogue and development. Diplomacy is harder because that is the key problem of the colleague's question. Diplomacy is still conducted through the nation state. And what we need to do is use the tool of diplomacy, but give the dialogue money and visibility it needs to happen on the local level. And there's a lot, I mean, again, essentially what Rumi Dialogue does is that form of linking it with diplomacy, but doing it, frankly, more aggressively in the places. I would start right now with Germany. I mean, what Angela Merkel said this weekend is outrageous, and unacceptable, and frankly not true. You go to West Berlin, and that is just simply not true. Obviously, she wants to win an election. She is, after all, a politician, and that's my problem with diplomacy. Most of the time, these are politicians. And, you know, the trust in the US Congress is at now like 8%. Well, these are the people who conduct diplomacy once the administration changes. And so you need to put diplomacy in the tools of ordinary people on the levels of Baghdad or Sarajevo that people trust. And so how it comes through, again, I think is through the political support, through the media and visibility of saying, it's okay, it's fine to dialogue, we stand behind this, rather than ongoingly taking picture with the club of bad boys. Defensive dialogue are the hardest. And it's simply because the training and the perception that are given to any military around the world is essentially, to be frank and fair to the many, many people who serve their nations. It is the form of engagement that aims not to enhance life, but frankly to end it. And so if our goal is through the military lens of victory, then it's hard to connect the two. That, however, is not possible anymore. There is no way that a situation in Iraq will have a winner. Bosnia didn't have a winner. Rwanda didn't have a winner. And so thinking that we will win in Afghanistan is a false premise. And so that link needs to start by having to change the paradigm, essentially.
Thank you, Miki. That was really inspiring.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank our wonderful audience here, thank the Rumi Forum for hosting us, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you.